Good morning, everyone. My name is Blake Wilhelm, and I work as archivist and librarian here at Northeast Alabama Community College. And I'd like to thank our president, Dr. David Campbell, and our head librarian, Dr. Julia Everett, for supporting events like we're having today. We're always looking for opportunities to bring interesting speakers and exhibits to the college. And I believe that the presentation that we have for you today is in keeping with our reputation. As many of you know, we were picked by Intelligent.com as having the #1 community college for cultural experiences of the 27 in the state of Alabama. Excuse me. Our speaker today is Dr. Jan Simek, and he'll speak to us on the topic of deep interest in our community, the Cherokee Syllabary inscriptions at Manitou Cave in what is now Fort Payne. The Cherokee Syllabary and pre-removal Cherokee history are important parts of the history of our region. On October 13th, 1828, the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper, the official newspaper of the Cherokee Nation, published Sequoiah's account of his invention of the Cherokee Syllabary. The story recounts a conversation that Sequoiah had with several Cherokee men at Sauta Village, near what is now Goose Pond in Scottsboro today. In this conversation, several Cherokee men lamented that white men could send their words across long distances in the form of written language, and that the Cherokee could not do so. Sequoiah explained that he could develop a system where they could do the same thing. In explaining this, he drew some figures in the dirt with a stick, and the men proceeded to laugh at him. From that meeting, Sequoiah traveled to his home near Willstown, which is in present-day Fort Payne, around the area of downtown Fort Payne, to spend some time in isolation and try to accomplish this task. And you can imagine, if you think about that trip from Goose Pond in Scottsboro to Willstown in downtown Fort Payne, as he pondered this idea, it took him very near where we sit today. So our presentation today, you might say, is hyper-local history. I could spend the whole time we have today introducing our speaker and his list of accomplishments from throughout his career, but I'll be brief. He came to the University of Tennessee in 1984, serving as a faculty member of the Anthropology Department. He served as head of the Anthropology Department, and from 2009 to 2011, he served as the 24th president of the University of Tennessee. Was named President Emeritus by the Board of Trustees. He's published over 100 scholarly works with a great deal of focus on the caves of France, and those of the Cumberland Plateau and the Appalachian Range. He's recently retired. When I talked with him, I got the impression that retirement only meant a little bit more flexibility for his schedule. That gives you an idea about how passionate he is about his work. With that, I present to you Dr. Jan Simek.
Thank you very much, Blake. I'm actually used at the University of Tennessee in teaching in very large lecture halls, as you might imagine, without a microphone, but given the setup here, I'll try to stay close to the podium here so you can help hear me. If you have a problem hearing me, raise your hand and I'll scream louder at you. And thank you, Blake, for the invitation to come here. We talked a lot, Blake and I, about what I would talk about when I came here because, as his introduction, I think, tells you, we've done quite a bit of work in this area and all the way up into Tennessee, actually all the way up into Kentucky, focused on how pre-contact Native people in the area used caves. But in 2006, really a little bit before that, for the first discoveries of things, the first identifications of things, we've done quite a bit of work in this area looking at Cherokee Syllabary and caves, and that's what I want to talk about today. I will talk about Manitou Cave because that was the first site that we recognized this syllabary in, and based on the recognition of syllabary in that site, we built a research team that has undertaken the study of these various sites as we've gone forward. But Manitou is not the only cave that has syllabary in it, and so I'll talk about a couple of others here that we have recognized after beginning the work at Manitou. It's one of those things in archaeology, though, that I think we've only scratched the surface of. Cherokee people were in this area for a very, very long time. According to their narratives of their origins, they came out of caves in this place or close to this place. So they have a long, long history here. The writing, obviously, and I'll talk a little bit about it, has less of a long history, but still, their engagement with caves and the underworld and the writing of inscriptions when the syllabary was in place in the underworld is certainly more widespread than we yet realize. I want to start, though, by focusing on the research team. I'm just here representing a group of people. And the group of people is predominantly Cherokee, because to study the ancient history of these people without their involvement, on the one hand, would be immoral. On the other hand, would be impossible. I am not Cherokee. I don't read the syllabary. I don't speak Cherokee. So to understand what these aspects of the archaeological record represent and what they tell us about how Cherokees viewed the world in which they lived, Cherokee engagement was critical. And so from the very beginning, we involved several Cherokee scholars in this work. Perhaps the first one that got involved and the one most engaged is the gentleman on your left, a man named Bo Carroll. Bo is a PhD student at the University of Tennessee in archaeology. He is also the principal archaeologist for the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina. His interest is specifically in Cherokee syllabary and the use of caves. Tom Belt is an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and he's also actually an enrolled member of the United Kidua Band of Cherokee Indians in Oklahoma. But for most of Tom's professional life, he worked as a Cherokee language expert in Western Carolina University's Cherokee Languages program. He's retired now, but especially for identification of and interpretation of some of the more complicated inscriptions that we've seen, and I'll talk a little bit about why they're complicated a little bit later. Tom's knowledge of the language and of the history of the writing system itself, the Sequoian syllabary, have been critical. And lastly, but not leastly, Julie Reed is a historian, an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and currently an associate professor of history at Penn State University. It was University of Tennessee's great loss. She began her historical career in our history department, worked with us for years, got involved in these projects, still is involved in these projects though, because she can't very well leave them behind either. But she's an expert in Cherokee culture and Cherokee history around the time of the invention of the syllabary. These are the scholars who are actually doing most of the work on what we find inside these caves. We are the archaeologists who find and document. These are the people that analyze and interpret. The Cherokee people, of course, were among, but not probably the only indigenous occupants of the area where we are today. But they actually, in the past, occupied a much larger area of the southern Appalachians. This is a map that shows the area at the time of European contact where Cherokee people lived or operated, hunted, gathered, carried out agriculture, had an imprint on the landscape. So they lived on a very large swath of country and knew it, of course, like the backs of their hands, and used it gently and capably for millennia. When Europeans arrived, almost immediately as they began to interact with the Cherokee people, they began to try to separate them from this land. And over the course of about 300 years, that separation was accomplished. This is a map of Cherokee treaty cessations, where pieces of the Cherokee homeland were divided off and given over to the American government. The sections that you see in different colors are pieces that correspond to what they gave up at certain times through certain treaties. The numbers that are on them is the order of that separation. So 1 and 2 in your lower right corner were the first lands that they gave up in northern Georgia. an integral part of their heartland. The low numbers were things that were taken from them early on. The higher numbers were properties that they gave up later in the interaction history. The most recent you see is down in where we are today, northern Alabama, northern Georgia, number 36. That was the last lands that Cherokee people gave up through the Treaty of New Echota. It resulted in the removal of the Cherokees beginning in 1830 and ultimately being completed in 1838. So they were picked apart by the white incursion, and their lands shrunk. It created a tremendous emotional and cultural crisis. Early on in the process, as some of the lands in the eastern mountains were ceded to white government, the Cherokees began to flee from the face of those white oppressors and move into areas further west of their landscape, including the area here. They were almost like refugee settlements that ultimately were set up here as Cherokees who did not want to interact with white culture tried to get away from it. Ultimately, that was not possible. But in this area of the lower Tennessee River, they established, beginning in the late 18th century, when Dragging Canoe, a war chief of the Cherokee, brought his people west of the Lookout Mountain and began to settle as far away from whites as they could get. They established what came to be called the Chickamauga communities in the lower Tennessee Valley, which is where we are now. And you see some examples of them on this map. Crowtown, Long Island, Lookout Mountain Town. Nickajack was Dragging Canoe's community itself. He was in southern Tennessee, running Watertown. There had been more traditional Cherokee communities over by Chattanooga in the Chickamauga Valley there, but these were communities of people who essentially were fleeing white incursion. All of that came to an end with the passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, a piece of legislation championed by Andrew Jackson. If you want to know why he shouldn't be on any of our money, it's because of this particular process that he undertook. The Indian Removal Act required that all Native people who were on native land east of the Mississippi River were to be removed to areas west of the Mississippi River. They were basically to be taken out of the United States of America, despite the fact that there were already people obviously living in the areas, most of them in Oklahoma, where the Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, etc., were to be taken. Jackson didn't care. He also didn't care about the fact that some of these Native peoples had fought in his army against the British in the War of 1812, had joined him as he went south and fought the Battle of New Orleans. Among those people, in fact, was Sequoyah, a Cherokee, at that time a young Cherokee man who joined up in the United States Army and went south with Jackson to fight. Jackson didn't care about any of that. He wanted Native people gone. And it wasn't just the Southeast where this happened. They removed Ojibwa people in the north. They removed Miami, Kickapoo, people from the Midwest. All Native people were moved west of the Mississippi. This process took almost a decade. It came to be called the Trail of Tears, but it basically involved the United States Army rounding up indigenous people from their homes of millennia, putting them into stockaded forts where they were concentrated prior to removal, and then they either walked or rode boats or rode wagons west. There was no choice involved. They could only take with them what they could carry. There were systems set up within these Native groups to try to help people to move as much of their possessions as they could. They did the best they could. And towards the end, at least for the Cherokee, the Cherokees themselves made a deal with the United States government so that they did most of the transport, because people tended to survive if it was Cherokee leaders that were moving them as opposed if it was the US government. But it was a tragic circumstance. You all know this story, I suspect. One of the principal towns in this Chickamauga, among these Chickamauga settlements, was a place called Willstown. And Willstown is what is today called Fort Payne. It's called Fort Payne because there was a fort there, U.S. military fort, that was established in order to remove the Cherokees from the surrounding community. And of course, when Willstown, the Cherokee name for it, became Fort Payne, was when the United States government took the land away from the Cherokees. It had started off as one of these Chickamauga communities where people went as a way of just getting away from white incursion, but it had built up into a very important Cherokee town. And as that had happened, more people had come from the eastern homeland and moved to the west, moved into this community. So it wasn't just people later in history, it wasn't just people who were trying to get away from white incursion. It was also Cherokee people who were simply had read the writing on the wall and were moving to this important community. And over time, there were more and more people who saw the future as requiring removal, and they were mixed together with more traditional Cherokee people who fought against removal. And there were tensions in this community as the Indian Removal Act was passed and things began to change. But it was a substantial community. In it, at least sometime in the early 19th century, lived a man named Sequoyah. Sequoyah was an intelligent scholar among Cherokee people. He was an artist. And sometime around the turn of the 19th century, when he first came into the Chickamauga settlements, although it had probably started earlier, he was born in East Tennessee, near a town today we call Von Orr. And he probably had some idea that a writing system might be a useful thing for Cherokee people to have before he came west. But when he did come west in the beginning of the 19th century, he began to develop a syllabary in earnest. It took, in all likelihood, a very long time, and as Blake said, we don't know a whole lot about that development. We know that he talked to the Lowrys at Saudi Town. The Lowrys were his uncles, in fact, his maternal uncles. The Cherokee are a matrilineal people, and so he had come to a community where his matrilineage lived, where his mother's family lived. He talks to them, and that's what's recorded in that article about why he thinks a syllabary or a writing system would be a useful thing, but we don't know much about how he did it or when he did it. We know he developed it once. There was concern, there were sort of rumors that he might be doing something that was spiritually problematic. His wife was concerned and she destroyed his papers, and so he had to reinvent it. But he remembered what he was doing and he reinvented it fairly quickly. He very early on came to the conclusion that the way to write the Cherokee language was not using an alphabet like ours, where letters were put together in ways that constructed words. He developed what's called a syllabary, where the individual symbols represent sounds that are part syllables in the Cherokee language. The beauty of his system was, on the one hand, there was a lot to remember. It comprises 86 individual symbols, each of which corresponds to a sound, a syllable in the Cherokee language. But he was able to do it with 86 symbols. And then all you do to construct words is you put the syllables together. That characteristic meant that it was very, very easy to learn. The story goes, this is a story, we're not sure it absolutely happened, but we'll go with it. He taught it to his children, and in particular his youngest daughter, Oyoye. And she showed the political leadership of the Cherokee people in Willstown that he could write something down, she could be in the next room, they could dictate a statement to him, he could write it down, send it over to her, and she could read it. And because of that, they saw the utility of it. This was in 1824. They saw the utility of the syllabary, and by 1828, the Cherokee tribe adopted the syllabary as their formal writing system. Within 3 years, 70% of the Cherokee people were literate. That's how easy it was to use if you spoke Cherokee. If you didn't speak Cherokee, I can attest to this, it's virtually impossible to figure out what it is. But it was a remarkable invention, a genius invention. And it became the official written language of the Cherokee people. He never saw that. I mean, he did, but he saw it from a distance. White people had gotten too close for Sequoiah's taste, and in 1828, when the tribe adopted the syllabary as its official writing system, he had already left and gone to Arkansas first to a group of Cherokee who had gone further west. They were often referred to as the old settlers, and he lived there to get further away from white people. But it became a fundamental element of the tribe. When he first invented it, he wrote it in his own hand. This is an example of that from the Gilcrease Museum in Oklahoma, of the syllabary written out by Sequoiah himself. Very quickly, the Cherokee people decided that this would be a nice thing to use for printing. And his handwritten syllabary was very difficult to translate into a printed version. And so it was modified by people here who ultimately came up with a syllabary that could use some already existing dyes from printing presses, or could be modified. Dyes could be easily modified to create Cherokee symbols. This is the printing press version of the syllabary. It's the one that if you go on the web, you're more likely to see this. But this is what Sequoiah developed. And so here's the problem, and it goes back to why Tom Belt is so important to our study. There are different syllabaries depending on when they were created and when they were used. Moreover, there are particular sounds that mean slightly different things in different dialects of Cherokee, so that East Tennessee Cherokee is a little bit different than, certainly than Cherokee today in Oklahoma, but it was different than the Cherokee spoken here. The same language, but sounds were given different meanings. And so you need to know who wrote what you're looking at in order to accurately translate it. And I'll come back to that when we look at the syllabary. All of this, though, resulted in a boom of Cherokee literacy. By 1828, you see an example here, Elias Boudinot, whose picture you see, was printing the Cherokee Phoenix, a newspaper that still exists, that's printed in both English and in Cherokee. It was printed at New Echota in the Chickamauga Valley, and that building is now part of a National Monument Park. That's the building where the printing press that printed the Cherokee Phoenix existed. It became an economic tool, a political tool, an information tool. It was a revolution in how Cherokee people communicated. There was an aspect of it, though, that we didn't know existed until fairly recently. And that is that people wrote it in more private contexts. The first inkling we got of this was from Manitou Cave in what at the time was Willstown, but what today is Fort Payne. The gate that you're looking at here was built to protect, in fact, the syllabary inside. For many, many years, Manitou Cave basically stood open. It had been a tourist cave in the late 19th, early 20th century. Pathways and roadways had been worked into it so visitors could wander through and look, and in many places write their names on the wall. Not such a great thing from our point of view. But it was filled with graffiti, and it stood open for many, many years until Annette Reynolds over here acquired it, and we arranged to put a gate in it. The Eastern Band of Cherokees helped to pay for this gate, and it is now protected. We went into Manitou Cave for the first time in 2004, and we went because the photographer that I work with, Alan Kressler, who's one of the authors here, had seen evidence of what we believed was pre-contact Native American activity in the cave. He had seen a number of these marks, and these marks are called stoke marks. They're produced by river cane torches being brushed against the wall to knock the ashes off, like a giant cigarette, in order to keep them burning. We know native people in the southeast used river cane for their lighting sources, but Europeans didn't. Europeans came from a tradition where pine pitch was more frequently used for torch material, and almost from the time that Europeans came here, that's what they used. Fairly quickly after, of course, they had oil lamps and all other kinds of things, but these river cane torch marks are almost always a dead giveaway of Native American activity. And there were some of these inside of Manitou Cave. There were also engravings on the walls in a couple of places. You see some examples of them here. And while we didn't have a very good idea of how old these were, they resembled in a lot of different respects some drawings that we had seen in other caves in the area that we knew were pre-contact Native American cave art, including an example here from not too far from Gunnersville, of a turkey engraved on the wall of a small cave. And you can see the sort of similarity. It's not as clear-cut a representational image in Manitou, but it has a lot of the same sort of structure and form. And we don't always see these as representational images. The pre-contact imagery can be sometimes quite abstract. So we went to Manitou to see if we could identify ancient artwork. But as we moved through the cave, very quickly on, we began to see inscriptions on the walls that were strange to us, to our white European eyes. They were not in the English language. They were not in the English alphabet. I'm an anthropologist, so I had some sense that they were in the syllabary. It wasn't surprising given where they were, in the town where Sequoyah lived. So it was at this point that we brought in Cherokee scholars. Bo was the first one. He was an undergraduate at the time at Western Carolina, but we began to work with him then. He eventually did his master's thesis on this site and published a paper with us in, he was the lead author on it, in the English European Archaeology journal Antiquity, that actually won the Southeastern Archaeological Conference's Patty Jo Watson Award for the best paper the year that he did it. Well, he identified this very quickly as syllabary, brought Tom Belt in to try to help us to figure out what it meant. And as we moved through the cave, it became clear that there were lots of inscriptions. One of the most extensive you see here, and I'm going to do a little bit on what it says, and then a couple that are close by, but let me make a caveat right away. As it turns out, some of this material, some of the inscriptions that are written on the walls of this cave are culturally fairly sensitive. And those culturally sensitive inscriptions, I'm not going to translate for you. They've been translated. The Cherokees know what they say, but they've asked us not to say what they mean. And you can imagine why, but that's not for me to tell you. I will tell you only that I won't tell you what they mean. But I will say that this one isn't that way, and so we can talk fairly extensively about it. And it's impressive. You can see right away, as we did when we saw it, that this is not an English inscription. It begins with these 4 syllables. And the Cherokees, Tom Belt and Bo, read it as the ones who lead. Leaders are identifying themselves. The second inscription identifies the leadership as involved in the ball game. We'll come back to what the ball game is in a minute. It's a public ritual that Cherokees carried out in the past and carry out today that is an act of renewal for the community. There's a date written in English, 1828. Sequoyah actually did develop in that handwritten syllabary numbers, but his colleagues, his fellow tribesmen said, numbers, why bother with that? Numbers are numbers. Let's just use the ones that we know already the Europeans use. And so that's what they did. he went back and as this inscription shows, by 1828, they were using Arabic numbers. The next phrase reads, in their month of April. So we're being given a date here. 1828, in their month of April. They is us, white people. Cherokees don't have April, but we do. And it's very clear this is in their month of April. And you can sort of guess what that is, the 30th day. April 30th, 1828, a ball game was played somewhere close by, and the leaders had come in this cave and made this inscription. So as I said, the ball game is more than a game. It's a game. It's a rough game. It's often referred to by Cherokees as the little brother of war. It was a way for people to undertake combat in groups of people that were too close to actually fight with each other. So it's sort of like football between Tennessee and Alabama. You play it, and but it's why we don't let guns on campus. But if it gets pretty rough before it's all done. So does this. But it was also a ritual. And it was more than just the public portion where people played. Over the course of the sometimes 2 or 3 days that a stickball game or a Cherokee ball game would take, the teams would stop periodically and disappear from the field, and they would pray. They would undertake cleansing of themselves for all the vicious things they had done in the context of the game, as they would in war. If they'd shed blood, they would clean it. If they would scratch themselves in penitence, they would pray for renewal. This was what they were really there to do. They still do it today. This is a game in Cherokee, North Carolina, a few years ago that I went and saw. You can see it's a lot like lacrosse, although it's not exactly the same, and there are no pads or helmets. I actually played a pickup stickball game once when I was much, much younger. I only played it once because it's rough. When they leave the field to undertake these religious oblations, they would go with a religious leader, and you see him standing in the center of this photograph, holding a scratching turkey claw that they would use for scratching the ball teams on the right, and on the left is a singer and a group of dancers, because there were ceremonies that went on. And they would go off and do this and come back and play and go off and do this, and it would go on and on and on until somebody won the game, or the game was stopped for whatever reason. So it's likely that's what's written on the wall of Manitou Cave, that the leader, that man in the middle, has come and made these inscriptions while his team in the darkness of this cave undertake these ceremonies of purification. A few years later, this gentleman here, who recently passed away, unfortunately, Marion Smith, one of the great cavers of North America, found another inscription that he's looking up at here. And what I want you to see is the surface of the rock was blackened, and then it was engraved. And here's what the engraving looks like. There's a whole line of Cherokee Syllabary across the middle of this. There's an English inscription above and an English inscription below, and I'm going to run through this very quickly. But let's start with the Cherokee. So here is a phrase, and you can see it written there and in a readable Cherokee script below. This says, "We are those that have blood come out of their nose and mouth." This is another way of saying we are in a red state, which means that they are involved in the stickball renewal process and are purifying themselves. The second part of it is here and says, "I am a respected man or man of authority." So again, it's the leader who is making this inscription and identifying him or himself. He actually writes his name. And his name is Richard Guess. And here's the inscription of that name. The upper part, as I said, is also in English. It says Mr. R.G., Richard Guess. So this is the full inscription. Mr. R.G., we are those that have blood come out of the nose and mouth, stickball players in the red state. I am a respected man or man of authority. I'm in charge. I'm the leader. My name is Richard Guess. So who's Richard Guess? He actually signs his name more than once in this cave, at least 4 times. To know who Richard Guess is, we have to go back to Sequoyah. Because Sequoyah, as all Cherokees at this point in history, had an English name that he used occasionally. Didn't like it very much, but he had it. His name was George Guess. And that's how he was recorded in the white community. His first wife was a woman named Uti Langley, also not a Cherokee last name, but together they had 5 children. George Jr. was born in East Tennessee near Vonore, where they were from in 1788. T.C. was born in the Cherokee Nation of East Tennessee in 1789. She's the only one that we know her passing was in Oklahoma in 1867. So she lived to a ripe old age. Polly Guess was born in 1790 in East Tennessee, and his 4th child was a second son, Richard, born in 1792 in East Tennessee. The little girl that famously learned the syllabary and communicated it back to him, Ayoka, was born in 1805, still in East Tennessee. So when exactly he moved to Willstown is not clear. But Richard Guess is Sequoyah's son. How do we know that it was the Richard Guess who wrote his name on the wall? Well, because he was actually quite literate, both in English and in Cherokee, and left a written record. During the removal, he carted for Cherokee people. He drove wagon teams that they could put their material on, and he took them to Oklahoma with it. And he did that under contract to the United States government. So there's a paper trail of receipts and justifications for his charges to the government for that carting. And this is one of those receipts. He writes his name at the top and he writes his name at the bottom. The signatures are pretty much the same, and they're pretty much the same as the one on the wall. So in all likelihood, the Richard Guess, who wrote his name in Manitou Cave, who was the religious leader of this group of stickball players, was Sequoyah's 4th son, or 4th child, Richard Guess. That's an important thing because, like his father, it means that Richard was a religious practitioner, a traditionalist, not simply a guy writing graffiti on the walls. And maybe more importantly, it means that the cave was being used for religious purposes. From our point of view, analyzing the cave art from more distant times, that's actually an important point too. We've always assumed that the cave art we find, some of it going back 7,000 years in the Appalachian region, was religious in nature. Here we have documentation by Cherokee people that caves were seen as sacred places that they used for religious purposes into the historic period. But that's not the only syllabary in this cave. Here we're going to get to where I can't tell you what it says. The more we worked in there and looked around to see what we could find, we eventually realized that, in fact, there was syllabary on the ceiling above our heads, some of it 35 feet in the air. There's Alan Kressler, that's Bo Carroll down below. There's Alan Kressler up above trying to photograph some of this ceiling syllabary. The inscriptions are small, and as you're going to see in a second, they have some peculiar characteristics. Here's one of those inscriptions. I can't tell you what it says, except to say that it starts out with an address. I am your grandson. And this is how Cherokee religious practitioners begin their conversations with the spirits, with the old ones. And clearly they believe the old ones are in this cave. And these religious practitioners, I'll identify one of them in a minute, had come there to communicate with these people. The other thing about them, if you look carefully at this, there's the Cherokee inscription on the bottom in the print syllabary, and it doesn't look a lot like the inscription itself until you realize that the inscription on the wall, the ancient inscription, the syllabary inscription, is upside down and backwards. It's written not so that people in the passageway can read it. It's written so that people in the rock can read it. It's a communication to somebody else. Cherokees would recognize it for what it was, but it wasn't, the address was not to them. And all of these syllabary inscriptions on the ceiling are written this way. There are others. This one identifies a particular activity involved in the ball game, scratching. It's actually involved in lots of different ceremonies. Smoking is another way of interpreting this, but it too is upside down and backwards. Here's an area that, like the inscription we saw before, is darkened and then engraved through. And if I process it a little bit, you can see it's the same as that first inscription. The difference between, well, it's not a difference. As was the case with the inscriptions of Richard Guess concerning the ball game, these inscriptions on the ceiling are also signed. And we'll come back to them in a little bit. But the signature is that sort of double upside down A in the upper right-hand corner. That is the way in syllabary one writes a name, the goose. We know a little bit about the goose, actually. He's in historic records. He was a religious practitioner who lived about 50 miles away from Willstown, but clearly came and wrote inscriptions on this cave, which implies that that religious practitioner, a very traditional person, was literate in the syllabary, could write inscriptions to the old ones, not just normally, but upside down and backwards, and could write his own name. Based on a document that was recovered from the National Archives that I'll show you in a second, we came to realize that there were other caves, even in Fort Payne, that have syllabary in them. We saw a reference at a certain point, Bo did, working through the archives, that there was a cave on the property of one Andrew Ross. Andrew Ross was a Cherokee leader who was the brother of the principal chief, John Ross, at the time of removal. John Ross worked diligently to try to prevent the removal. Andrew Ross had become a wealthy planter in Fort Payne. His house still stands, that's it. It was a plantation house. He held African Americans enslaved to work his fields. He was not so demanding about remaining here. He just wanted fair pay for what he could get if the Cherokees were required to move. He did move ultimately to Oklahoma, as did John Ross. Became a member of the Light Horse and one of the first justices of the Cherokee Supreme Court. He was killed in 1840, and I've never been able to track down the history of his death, except that he was serving in the Light Horse, which was the tribal police, basically, and there was a Cherokee Civil War that erupted between those who advocated for removal and those who wanted to stay in their homeland, that played out over a very, very long period of time in Oklahoma once the removal was complete. It's never clear that he paid a price, but a lot of Cherokee leaders who advocated removal were murdered or killed for their practice. So I talked about this document that talks about a cave that has, as it turns out, has syllabary in it. It is one of the papers one finds in the diaries of a Daniel Buttrick. Buttrick was, along with his colleague Payne, was a missionary who worked in Willstown, was at the mission in Willstown, but took copious notes in his journals about his day-to-day activities and interactions with Cherokee people, some of them quite remarkable. This is a really remarkable one because in this entry he talks about a cave that's not very far from Andrew Ross's house. And Buttrick is taken to this cave, and as he moves through this cave, he believes he encounters what the Cherokee call the little people who are living in the cave. The little people are spirit beings who live in the forest and are kind of tricksters. They'll mess with you pretty incessantly if they are so inclined. They're kind of spirits of the woodlands, and they're little, as the name implies. He believes, and he talks about it on this journal entry, that they are inside this cave and he saw them, and that they had created a house inside this cave with bookcases and beds. So we felt like we needed to go over to Andrew Ross's house and try to see if we could find caves. So it was actually Alan and Bo and Julie and I one day went and in the Alabama Cave Survey, we found a cave not very far from Andrew Ross's house. And when we went in the cave, we saw several things. One was there were signatures in there of members of the Ross family in English. So here's one. There are two more, a K. Ross and a G. Ross, none by Andrew, but he had all kinds of relatives that, especially as the removal was approaching, came and stayed with him, hoping that he would be able to protect them from this removal. He wasn't obviously able to. And you can see there's been a bit of graffiti painted over it since. But in and among the Ross signatures in English, there are also syllabary signs. I'm not supposed to tell you what they say, so I won't. But they are pairs of syllables, and they're repeated over and over again on the interior of this cave. So, Manitou was the first that we found, but there were more. A few years later, Alan was exploring a cave that's owned by the Southeastern Cave Conservancy, a little bit to the north. I won't use its name, although one of the board members is here and he knows the name. But Alan was exploring this because there was a cleanup people wanted to do here. They wanted to clean the graffiti off the walls of the cave, and they wanted to be sure there wasn't something there that they shouldn't clean off, cave art. And so Alan went in. Here he is, getting ready to go in. And on the wall, he saw what by now we knew to be another Cherokee Syllabary inscription. So here's Bo. We called him immediately. He came to the cave and we began documenting this inscription. It merited protection as well. So Kristen Bobo, who you see here, is one of the best welders I've ever seen, and she welded up a giant gate to protect this section of the cave where the syllabary is. And it is today under good management, in a conservation mode, and protected by a gate that has, quite honestly, never been breached in the course of the time that we've used it. The cave's called Howard's Waterfall Cave. It's on this slide, so I'll go ahead and use it. And it's almost at the junction between Georgia, North Georgia, and Alabama. There was a Cherokee town there, a smaller one called Stockaway, that you can see here. And so almost certainly the people that made this inscription were somehow connected to that community. It is one panel here, and you see it here with a little bit of graffiti over the top of it. I'm going to use a program called D-Stretch that actually amplifies certain parts of the light spectrum so that it enhances the writing as I go through this. But this is it as it appears today. There is the de-stretched version. You can see some of the inscription comes out a little bit clearer, some of it not so much. So we begin at the top again, as we did in Howard's Waterfall. And this phrase says, "this that's been asked about." Or according to Tom, this is something that we are very concerned about. The second inscription reads, "we found them." we've located whatever it was we were looking for. The third sections, we divided it equally between the three of us. So there are 3 people involved here, and they undertook whatever this task is together. And the last inscriptions reads, taking hold or taking back, we took back what was ours. So according to Bo and Tom, this inscription has to do with a completely different issue, but one that also has important religious connotations, and that is revenge, or the system of blood revenge that characterized Cherokee interaction. If lives were taken, you had to go get the same lives back. This is grim stuff, and I won't go too much more into it. But that's what they believe was being dealt with here. A notification was being painted on the walls that said, we have achieved our blood revenge. What's interesting is, if you look carefully, this inscription too is signed by a religious practitioner, by the goose. And in this place, we're a long ways away from Fort Payne. So he would travel for blood revenge. He would travel for ball game ceremonies. It's clear that caves were very important and were places where Cherokees undertook religious practice, ceremonial behavior of a variety of different kinds. And I think that's, again, important from the point of view of the more ancient artwork. We can expect that it was an important part of the overall religious practice of Native American peoples in this region. I'll finish up with this. So, of course, the Cherokees were removed. And this is the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail, and it shows the routes that Cherokee people out of their homeland, first in the east, in the southern Appalachian Mountains, and then into Fort Payne, into the Chickamauga settlements, and ultimately into Arkansas and the old settler settlements. They were moved bodily and forcibly to Oklahoma, where most Cherokees live today. There are a number of known routes, and if you've paid any attention, there's obviously an important set of routes here. You see Fort Payne in northern Alabama. The people that were removed here, the Benge Detachment, Julie Reed actually has relatives who were removed with the Benge Detachment, were taken up through Huntsville to Pulaski. They crossed the river, the Tennessee River, south of Montgomery County, went up into southern Illinois and came down through Poplar Bluff, Batesville, Arkansas, to Fayetteville, and then into the Indian Territory in Oklahoma. But there were lots of other routes. And the one I want to point out in particular here, can you see my cursor? Not very well, huh? Is this one here, the northernmost one, that comes out of East Tennessee, goes up through Nashville, crosses the Kentucky border in Montgomery County, Tennessee, and goes up to Hopkinsville. Those people were actually taken to Pulaski, or to southern Kentucky, and were put on boats and taken down the river and taken over. As that removal occurred, they were at the Tennessee-Kentucky state line. They were encamped for a while at a place called Port Royal. And at Port Royal, there are large segments of the Trail of Tears that remain. This is one of those segments. It was a fort. But close by to that fort was a cave, a very large cave that today is part of a Tennessee State Park called Dunbar Cave. We've done a lot of work in Dunbar Cave back in the day because it actually contains Mississippian-era Native American artwork that we had documented. But because it had this kind of focal point in the removal history, we decided we ought to go into this cave and look for syllabary. And so Bo and Julie came, and we did about 3 miles of underground passageways. And sure enough, we found syllabary. The syllabary here, though, has 2 or 3 important differences than what I've showed you before. First of all, at least as far as Tom and Bo can tell, it's names. And at least in some instances, it's almost like it's European names written in syllabary. Julie, 2 syllables, written with 2-syllable elements. But it's syllabary. Of that, there's no doubt. The second important characteristic is, as you can see, it's written in yellow paint. Yellow paint was originally quite bright, but today it's kind of weathered down to an almost brownish yellow. Here's another name written in syllabary. And in and among these syllabary elements are other names written in English, in the same paint, in the same hand. Here's one of I.P. Cox and J.O. Cox, written not prior to removal in 1838, not during the removal, but much afterwards in 1855. But as it turns out, Cox is a very common name in Cherokee, among Cherokee people, especially in Oklahoma. And this paint is of a very particular sort. It's a paint called cadmium yellow. We've actually done chemical analysis of it. We use portable spectrometers that don't require us to scrape any of the paint off or do any damage to the inscriptions themselves, but we can tell what the elemental composition, the chemistry of them is. And in this case, it's cadmium, which of course is a radioactive substance. It's what people used to paint on watch faces, and all the women that were working in the sweatshops in New York doing this came down with various forms of cancer in the 19th and 20th century. It came on the market in 1854, cadmium yellow, and it was only on the market for about 20 years before everybody realized this was not any good, and it was taken off the market. So the date of cadmium yellow falls exactly where this date is. Cherokee syllabary, Cherokee names, written in a cave in a place that the removal passed through 20 years after the removal was done. We believe that these were Cherokees who came back. There was no prescription against Cherokees moving once they were moved to Oklahoma. And they did come back often. They had family here. They tried very hard to get more of their material if they hadn't been able to take everything. There were all kinds of legal processes that were going on, and it was their homeland, and they loved it. So we believe that this is evidence for Cherokee return. Also in syllabary, representing the identity of people who maybe had been involved in the removal through this area, or had relatives who had been involved as they moved through. So, these Cherokee syllabary elements, I think, tell us a lot. Here in the words of the people themselves, we have testimony to what they used caves for, how they saw caves, and why they were important. And as you've seen, I hope, there were a whole lot of different reasons why they were important, that were historically contingent, that were linked to very ancient practices, and that were part of the day-to-day spiritual life of Cherokee people. They contained memory. They contained interaction with the spirit world. They were remarkable, and Cherokees saw them as that and labeled them as that. These more recent ones, though, I think are really interesting. They tell us that we can expect to see syllabary in a lot of contexts we might not have expected it. And as we do this survey work, we need to be very careful not to sort of dismiss things that are a little bit later in time. But more than anything, what they tell us is that Cherokee people, here's Bo and Julie, have been on this landscape in their religious beliefs forever. They are still here. These are the descendants of these people who are studying the ancient inscriptions, who are the only ones who can help us understand them. When they do that, the richness of what we learn is extraordinary compared to what we would see. That's probably Cherokee syllabary, I can't read it, would be my conclusion if we hadn't engaged the descendant communities in this work. It's been really a wonderful kind of research. But most importantly, Cherokee people are still with us. They are all around us. They teach at Penn State. They work for the tribe. They're graduate students. They are the first Americans, and always will be. To leave them out of our thinking when we talk about history. And Fort Payne hasn't, but their engagement with the construction of history is always going to make for a richer understanding than not having them there. So thank you all for having me here. It's been a real pleasure. I thank our contributors. I'll answer any questions if I have any time at all to do that, Blake.
I'll start out.
Go ahead.
You know, I thought it was interesting that a new medium is used by the traditionalists to preserve traditional culture. And I was wondering if cultural anthropologists have studied this all over the world. Is that something that you've ever seen and that you see regularly?
So I'm not a cultural anthropologist.
Sorry.
When I worked in France, I worked in Paleolithic sites.
Okay.
So that's an interesting problem in and of itself. I came to this work because I work in sites that are as much as 35 or 40,000 years old in France, where there are paintings, some of them. Trying to understand those when you don't have somebody to tell you what they mean is virtually impossible. So this to me is like a light going off. That when you have descendants who can tell you about it, boy, you're wasting your time if you don't talk to them. Many archaeologists, quite honestly, don't. And they're losing an enormous amount of richness to what they understand. One of the things I'll note, do I see people using these kinds of innovations to maintain traditional ways in other parts of the world? So in the Paleolithic, I don't really know, except when we look at, not for the art, but except when we look at things like stone tool production. Because if you know your Paleolithic history, there are a whole series of different sort of technological traditions that rise up. This is among ancient European people, and begin to spread and take over how people make tools at particular points in time. But they don't necessarily change the other aspects of culture. And I think the lesson there is we see here how different components of culture change and flow, not necessarily in concert with other aspects of culture. So that innovation can serve traditional ways easily. And did here. Remember, it was a traditionalist who invented it. And why did he invent it? The story goes he invented it because that way Cherokee people could communicate and white people couldn't read it. And knowing what we do know about Sequoyah, and I'll stress, for all that's been written about him, we actually know very little. He was a secretive dude. And he didn't want white people to know who he was. The Lowrys are some of the best information about him, because they were literate in English and they wrote down, they had journals too. But boy, he was a shadow. And he periodically would leave because he just didn't want to become so visible. One of the great minds of 19th century America, there's no doubt about that. But a difficult character to try to understand. Even for Cherokee, I mean, Julie's spent years and years trying to do that. You know, but so there's a traditionalist who, in the service of maintaining traditional culture, invents this thing. And those are the first people who use it. Very quickly, Boudinot begins to print newspapers, and you get, you know, the daily gossip. It's true. But that's not what it was invented for, and the traditionalists used it for very different things, I think, than the others did. But everybody used it. Yes?
That's two questions. You worked with the Cherokee. Did you not pick up some of the Cherokee language? No.
I'm too old to do that. You learn language when you're little, you know. Yeah, go ahead. I know a few words, but none of them can I repeat in public. So there's all kinds of parallels, frankly. And I'll tell you one of the things as a teacher of archaeology that I always try to stress in my especially my introductory classes, is that no matter where you are in the world, there is sort of a sequence of development that occurs that begins, we all begin as hunters and gatherers. We know our landscapes very well. We use them carefully and gently. It was 500,000 years ago in southern France and maybe 25,000 years here, but that same interaction, that same relationship, I think, holds. Over time, as we get to know our environments better, we invent agriculture. We develop a way to produce food that doesn't require we chase after it. We still chase after it because it tastes good, but it doesn't become the sort of focal point of what we do. That happens 15,000 years ago in the Old World, in the Mediterranean region. It begins to happen around 4,500 years ago here, but it happens here. Native people invented agriculture in the Cumberland Plateau. It's one of the 10 places in the world where agriculture is independently invented. They start with things like goosefoot and sumpweed, and they domesticate them. They change the plants genetically. We know they do it. Then corn shows up, and they adopt that easily and become large-scale farmers. Then we become large-scale farmers, and that almost always means two things. It means we concentrate on a few crops that are very productive, that has some not such good health implications, and we start fighting with each other over land. And that happens because you got to have the land to grow things. That happens everywhere in the world. So there are these similar patterns. The time scales are just different. All of it means, to me, that we are all the same. We all have the same intellectual capacities. We come out of different evolutionary histories, ecological histories, and so things happen at slightly different ways. The plants are different, the animals are different, so we don't all end up in exactly the same place. But we are biologically the same. We are far more similar to each other, all of us, than we are different. Yes, sir?
In the various caves that you went into north, in this area down here, did you find any evidence of any burials in there?
So I don't want to talk about that, and the Cherokees wouldn't want me to. Yes, sir?
The Cherokee, did they do the mud writings in caves?
So the cave art that we have in the southeast, there are actually 3 or maybe even 4 different ways that cave art is made. There are mud glyphs where there's drawings in mud. There's 30 some odd sites like that. There are paintings. There are engravings where they literally engrave into the rock itself. The earliest examples that we have of that are up along the Tennessee-Kentucky border. And there's one site that's almost 7,000 years old. There's another one that's 6,500 years old. And quite honestly, we don't know who those people were. They're Native Americans, but to identify them as to tribe, we know that the Shawnees, the Cherokees, occupied that land at different times, but we don't know who made those pictures, and we don't know who was there 7,000 years ago. So it's hard to say who makes any of these particular things. What we can say is that when Europeans arrived in most of this area, you saw the map, it was the Cherokees that were here. So, and if you ask Cherokees about it, they would say, yes, those are our ancestors that did that.
Their writings in Jackson and DeKalb County.
So I'm not going to talk about it anymore. There are caves in Alabama that have art with them, yes. There are also open air sites in Alabama that have art in them. Pretty extraordinary ones. So the thing to remember more than anything about these Native American indigenous people here, the first peoples, is that they didn't have the same political boundaries we do. They didn't know they were crossing into Tennessee, nor could they have cared. They lived in different spaces than we think of them today. So that the artwork that we look at goes all the way up into Kentucky and goes all the way down. Actually, there's a cave art site in Florida. They have an extensive network of interaction and always did. And so in that context, it's very hard to say those were Cherokees, those were Chickasaws, those were Choctaws. They were probably all of them.
Follow up on Dr. Andrews.
Do many of them speak Cherokee? So, yes and no. Far fewer than I think they would like. The language is in danger because the truly first language native speaking Cherokees are older. We're losing them all the time, and there are fewer and fewer of them. But all three Cherokee groups, the United Kidua Band in Oklahoma, the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, and the Eastern Band of Cherokee, have very intensive language preservation programs. That's where Tom worked, where Tom Belt worked. Bo's part of it, trying very hard to teach young Cherokees how to speak the language and how to read the language. Speaking is first. If you can't speak it, you can't read it, or it's very hard. So they're working hard on it. It's a difficult thing, but if you've ever gone, and the closest place we are here for Cherokee people is to the Qualla boundary in North Carolina on the other side of the Smokies. If you ever go there, every sign is in both languages. On the University of Tennessee campus, we have a lot of places where everything's in both languages. Just, if not, to be able to read it so that especially children understand that it's an equivalent. It's there. But it's a difficult task because, you know, once Cherokees were removed, once they were in North Carolina, missions were set up, and those missions were basically designed to do away with native culture. So the languages were not taught. They were, in fact, discouraged. That played out in Willstown. There were parts of the community where the missions were that were progressive, and if the children went to those schools, their hair was cut and they were told not to speak Cherokee ever. It's why Sequoia and his band stayed away from those people and preserved the native culture. Saudi was a traditionalist community, and eventually they left because the pressure was too great. It was being supported by the white culture, the dominant culture. It's not a happy history. If there's any Cherokees here, I would let you speak about this, but it's just not. We didn't do well. I'd like to think we would do better today. I'm not sure, frankly. But I hope that answers your question.
One more question.
Go ahead.
Seeing the extensive boundary of the Cherokee Nation, at the height of that, how many Cherokees were there?
So that's a really good question. In the tens of thousands, probably 60, 80. You know, there were 80,000 or thereabouts that were removed, and a quarter of those died on the Trail of Tears. Today, it's the most populous Native American people. 300,000 in Oklahoma alone. 25, 30,000 in North Carolina. Yes, ma'am. We've got to give this room up shortly, but
Speaking of local,
yeah.
finding arrowheads as a child and ancestry coming from Cherokee Choctaw, how do you get answers of open air evidence on your property? Who would you contact?
So you live in Alabama? So, that's not a bad thing. It's only football that we, you know. So I would suggest two things. There's a state archaeologist in Alabama.
But it's hard to get anybody to come out.
And there is an archaeological research entity at the University of Alabama at Moundville.
All day.
And so what do you have? Okay, all right. You know, those are your best bets.
Yeah, dealing with the Alabama forestry and just the ones through the government, you know, Army Engineer Corps, stuff like that, how you explain to them your telltales of your family and then protection of raw land. Being of this, it's just, it's hard.
Well, I understand. So
You're doing your own history.
So imagine from my point of view, you know, we've been doing this work, looking for these caves for 35 years. We have over 100 of them, caves with artwork in them. And as I said, they go back quite a ways in time. We have a lot still to look at. There are 11,000 some odd caves in the state of Tennessee. There's 8,000 in Alabama, there's another 6,500, 7,000 in Kentucky, and there's no one else that does this. So we're busy. I'm retired, but I feel like I'm, and the most disturbing thing, and I'll finish with this if that's okay. The most disturbing thing about this is that there is no legal foundation to protect these places.
Right. Encroachment on people from out of
Doesn't matter. Having worked in Europe as much as I did, in Europe, if you found a decorated cave, they would shut it down. The government would come and buy it, and it would be a protected property from that point on. Here, we have always put, and I understand this, it's who we are. We have always put private property first. And that's what we're up against. It's very hard to fight it. It is frustrating as hell. Now, that being said, in my experience, people that own these kinds of places tend to be very, very devoted to their preservation. I have encountered very few people over the course of my career that see them as ways of making money. They're not. Most often they're so dangerous that I don't want to go in them, but I have to. But most of the time, people on whose property these sites lay are devoted to their conservation. That's a great thing. But if that wasn't true, it's just who we are. It's just how our laws work. And, people make fun of tree huggers and spotted owl people and all of that. It's the same thing. If there's elements of the world that deserve protection, our system is not set up to do that, plain and simple. So I don't know what the answer is to you about what to do, because we confront the same thing. There are conservancies. You're looking at two of them right here. There's an organization called the Southeast Cave Conservancy. There's the National Speleological Society. There's the Nature Conservancy. There's the Archaeological Conservancy. There are groups who will buy property to protect it. But that's what you have to do. You have to be the owner. Push your representatives, push your senators, your congressmen. It won't get you anywhere, but at least you'll feel like you're doing something. Thank you all very much.